Old Pajeda Conservancy, early morning. A tiny lion cub lay motionless beneath a sparse acacia tree, its body fragile and wasted, the dull fur stretched thin over sharp ribs. Ranger Amani moved carefully through the brittle grass, every step measured, her eyes locked on the still figure. The cub's chest rose and fell with faint, uneven breaths, a delicate struggle to cling to life. Its half-open eyes, cloudy and glazed, revealed exhaustion deeper than any visible wound. The cub was starving, its strength nearly gone. Amani knelt beside it and brushed dust from its face with a soft hand. The thinness of the cub's body was alarming. Every bone was outlined against its skin, its small frame fragile as dry twigs in the wind. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling just slightly, and lifted the limp head. The cub's neck was weak beneath her touch. Its breathing was shallow enough to be mistaken for silence. The dry earth beneath was cracked and lifeless, scattered with brittle leaves that whispered in the cool breeze. Around them, the conservancy was quiet in the early light, the distant call of a lone bird cutting through the stillness. The sun had risen just enough to warm the tops of the trees, but here in the grass the chill clung stubbornly. Amani's heart ached with a familiar weight. The cub had been left behind. The pride had moved on, leaving it vulnerable and alone. The soft whimpers escaping its lips were almost inaudible. A desperate plea for help that the wild seldom answers. She scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of the mother or siblings, but the landscape was empty, stripped of life and hope. The stakes were painfully clear. Without immediate care, this cub would not survive the day. The dry season had taken its toll, starving prey and predators alike. Food was scarce, water even more so. For a cub this small and weak, the chances were slim. Amani gently lifted the cub into her arms. Careful to support its fragile body, it lay limp, barely responding, yet the faintest movement of its paws against her jacket offered a sliver of hope. She whispered softly, "Stay with me, little one," the words barely above the wind. The cub's faint gaze seemed to meet hers briefly, a flicker of recognition or perhaps confusion. The animal was too weak to understand, but something in that fragile exchange held a silent promise. Help was near. As she carried the cub toward the ranger vehicle, the rough grass brushed against her legs, each step deliberate, the cub's warmth barely perceptible against her chest. The air smelled dry and faintly of earth and dust, the kind of smell that fills places where life is fighting hard to hold on. Amani's mind moved quickly. The field vet was waiting nearby, but time was slipping through their fingers. The cub needed nourishment immediately, something to replenish the body wasting away from hunger. Without milk, without warmth, it would not last. She recalled past rescues, moments like this when every breath counted, every second was a battle. The cub twitched faintly in her arms, a sign that life had not yet abandoned it completely. If they could get the cub stable, if the vet could provide fluids and food, maybe, just maybe, the tiny lion could pull through. But the risks were sharp and present. If the cub grew too weak to suckle, or if shock set in, death would come swiftly and silently. Amani felt a gentle movement, a soft whine escaping the cub's lips, so faint it was almost swallowed by the wind. She adjusted her hold, speaking again. "You're almost there." Her voice was steady, calm, carrying no false hope but a quiet determination. The landscape stretched wide and empty around them, the grasslands waiting, indifferent to the struggle unfolding within their borders. The sky above brightened with slow, steady light, promising a new day, even as this one held a life balanced on the edge. The cub's breathing remained shallow but steady, its tiny heart beating beneath the fragile chest. Amani's pace quickened slightly, the ranger vehicle coming into view beyond the trees. The urgency in her steps was matched by the cub's faint stirrings, small but vital signs of life refusing to give up. This was a rescue measured not in triumph, but in fragile hope. Every moment without nourishment was a threat, every small movement a chance to survive. The dry wind shifted, rustling the grass, carrying the faint calls of distant wildlife. For now the cub remained alive, fragile and small, but alive. Amani held the tiny lion close, a lifeline in a harsh world, moving toward a chance to save what might otherwise be lost. The morning light grew stronger, but the fight was far from over. The cub lay still but breathing, held safe in gentle hands as the day stretched ahead with all its dangers and possibilities. The field vet's tent stood quietly in the mid-morning heat of Old Payeta Conservancy. Amani gently settled the tiny lion cub onto a soft blanket, careful to support its fragile frame. The cub's eyes were barely open, heavy with exhaustion and hunger. Its breathing was shallow, uneven. The vet prepared a small bottle of warm milk. The scent was unfamiliar to the cub, but necessary for survival. Amani approached slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. She held the bottle near the cub's lips, coaxing softly. The cub twitched, its tiny tongue flicking weakly at the rim. The first sips were shallow, barely enough to ease the hunger, but they sparked a faint pulse of hope. Amani whispered, "That's it, little one." The cub's body shivered slightly, a sign of life fighting through the exhaustion. Around them, the conservancy hummed with distant bird calls and the soft rustling of grass. The warmth of the blanket beneath the cub contrasted with its wasted body and dull fur. The vet checked vital signs quietly, nodding with cautious optimism. If the cub refused the milk, the stakes were grave. Starvation had weakened the muscles needed to suckle. Without nourishment, its organs would soon fail. Amani kept the bottle steady, encouraging the cub with soft words and gentle touch. The cub's eyes flickered open briefly, focusing weakly on the bottle before closing again. Each swallow was a small victory, a refusal to surrender. Its ribs still showed sharply beneath its skin, breath short and uneven, but life stirred within. The cub's limbs twitched occasionally, and faint whines broke the silence. Amani's hands remained steady, calm. The vet prepared fluids, ready to assist if needed. But for now, the milk was a lifeline pulling the cub back from the brink. Minutes passed, and the cub's movements grew slightly stronger. It drank more steadily, the milk slipping down in small, vital gulps. Amani's eyes met the cub's faint gaze, a quiet connection in the still tent. The tension lingered. If the cub faltered now, death would come swiftly and silently. Outside, dry wind whispered through the tent flaps, carrying scents of earth and distant trees. The wild waited beyond, unforgiving and vast. Amani adjusted the bottle's angle and murmured again, "You're almost there." The cub's body trembled, a fragile pulse breaking through exhaustion. It drank more eagerly, a sign that survival was still possible. The vet smiled faintly and nodded. If the cub could keep feeding, there was hope to regain strength and face the wild again. But the moment remained fragile. The quiet deepened, filled only by the soft sounds of feeding and the slow, steady breaths of a tiny lion clinging to life. Each swallow was a promise, fragile but real, in a world that demanded much. The morning sun climbed higher over Old Payeta Conservancy as Amani continued to care for the fragile cub. She kept the bottle steady, encouraging the tiny lion to drink. The cub's weak breaths rose and fell with the slow rhythm of survival, its body still thin and trembling. Around them, the dry grass swayed gently, but a sudden movement caught Amani's attention. From the edge of the clearing, a shadow shifted, low, deliberate, and watchful. A lioness stood just beyond the tree line, her eyes fixed on the small figure cradled in Amani's arms. She was hesitant, muscles tense but calm, clearly protective. The lioness's gaze flicked between the cub and Amani, a silent weighing of threat and trust. The air grew thick with quiet tension. Amani's heart beat steadily, careful not to make sudden moves. She understood the delicate balance. This was a wild mother watching over her young, unsure whether this human meant harm or help. The lioness took a slow step forward, then paused, ears flicking back and forth, alert to every sound. The cub stirred in Amani's arms, letting out a soft whimper. The lioness responded with a low, guttural sound, a warning, or perhaps a plea. Amani lowered her voice, speaking softly, "It's okay, girl." She did not reach out or try to move closer. Instead, she stayed still, letting the lioness decide whether to approach or retreat. The lioness's body was lean but powerful, scarred in places, a survivor shaped by the unforgiving wild. Her eyes held both caution and fierce determination. Slowly, she shifted her weight, inching a few steps closer, but still keeping a safe distance. The The tension in the clearing was palpable. One wrong move could shatter the fragile truce. Amani's mind raced. If the lioness accepted her presence, the cub might have a chance. But if she fled or attacked, the rescue could end in failure. The cub's soft breaths filled the quiet space between them, a fragile thread connecting human and wild. As the lioness lingered, her gaze softened just a little, the raw edge of suspicion giving way to cautious curiosity. She circled slowly, staying within sight but not closing the gap. Amani's calm breathing matched the slow pulse of the moment. Every detail mattered: the flick of a tail, the rise of the cub's chest, the slight tilt of the lioness's head. The air was thick with unspoken understanding, a delicate dance of trust and survival. Minutes passed like hours. Then, the lioness lowered her head slightly, eyes never leaving the cub. It was a subtle gesture, but powerful, a sign that she was not turning away. Amani felt a small surge of hope, tempered by the weight of what still lay ahead. The wild and human worlds had met in this quiet clearing, connected by a tiny life fighting to live. The stakes were clear. If the lioness accepted the fragile bond, the cub might recover and return to the pride. If not, the distance between them would grow too wide, and the cub's chance would slip away. Amani continued to hold the cub carefully, offering milk, her eyes flicking often to the lioness still watching from the shadows. The sun climbed higher, casting long, warm rays across the grass. The moment stretched taut, fragile as a breath held too long. Outside the clearing, life continued. Birds called, wind shifted through the trees, and the vast conservancy held its steady rhythm. But here, in this fragile space, a quiet story of survival and trust unfolded between a woman, a cub, and the lioness who guarded it from a distance. Got it. Here's Chapter 4, rewritten in multiple paragraphs following your exact style and tone, between 500–700 words. Tata. The lioness stayed at the edge of the clearing, her body low and tense. Each movement was slow and careful, as if she weighed every step before taking it. Her eyes never left the cub nestled in Amani's arms, small and fragile. The air between them was heavy with quiet uncertainty, a fragile pause suspended in the morning light. Amani held the cub gently, feeling its weak pulse beneath her hands. She met the lioness's steady gaze, sensing the wild mother's fierce protectiveness mingled with hesitation. The lioness's muscles twitched, ready to spring or flee, but for now she stayed just within sight. Slowly, the lioness took a step closer. Her tail flicked lightly against the dry grass, a soft swish that broke the stillness. Her nostrils flared, breathing in the unfamiliar scents: human, cub, warm blood, and the earth itself. Amani's voice was low, almost a whisper. "We want to help." There was no threat in her words, only calm intention. The lioness blinked, weighing the moment. Her ears twitched, catching the faint sound of the cub's uneven breathing. The small lion stirred, its head moving toward Amani's chest, a fragile sign of life fighting through exhaustion. If the lioness retreated now, the cub's chances would slip away, left vulnerable to hunger and danger. But the lioness did not pull back. Instead, she shifted her weight forward, closing the distance until she stood just a few meters away. Her eyes remained locked on the cub, sharp and watchful. There was a flicker of recognition there, as if she sensed the care and urgency in Amani's steady hands. The cub let out a faint whimper, barely audible but enough to catch the mother's attention. The lioness lowered her head slightly, a silent, delicate gesture of acceptance. The tension between human and wild eased just a fraction, a fragile thread of trust beginning to form. Amani's breath slowed as relief settled in her chest, but she knew the moment was delicate. Trust was hard-earned in the wild and easily lost. The lioness could still retreat or become defensive at any sign of threat. For the cub, the mother's decision would mean everything. The soft wind carried the scent of dry grass and earth, wrapping around them in the vast quiet of the conservancy. The sun cast warm light across the lioness's tawny coat, outlining her lean strength. She breathed steady and calm, her eyes never leaving the cub or the woman who cradled it. Carefully, Amani shifted her hold on the cub, making sure not to startle either lion. The silence stretched on, deep and profound, every heartbeat loud in the stillness. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to this fragile space between predator and human. Then, with a final slow step, the lioness closed the gap just a little more. She lowered her head gently, never breaking eye contact. Amani reached out her hand slowly, but stopped just short of touching her. The lioness did not flinch or pull away. It was a quiet peace, a fragile truce that might save a life. In this moment hung the future, a tiny cub, a wary mother, and a woman willing to bridge the divide. The clearing seemed to hold its breath as the wild and the human found an unlikely accord, delicate as the morning light filtering through the leaves. The quiet clearing held a fragile stillness as Amani continued to feed the cub. The soft, almost imperceptible sounds of the tiny lion's weak sucking broke the silence. Nearby, the lioness stood a few steps away, her tawny eyes never leaving the small form nestled carefully in Amani's arms. Her body was relaxed but alert, every muscle ready, shaped by the wild instincts of a mother guarding her young. The cub's ribs rose and fell slowly beneath its thin skin, each breath a small victory against exhaustion. Amani kept the bottle steady, coaxing the fragile life to drink with gentle hands. Her touch was unwavering, careful not to startle either the cub or the lioness. The wild mother shifted slightly, the faintest movement as she inched closer, drawn by the unfolding scene. She lowered her head slowly, her nose dipping toward the rim of the bottle. There was no sudden motion, no threat, only a cautious, measured approach filled with unspoken understanding. The space between human and wild shrank in those quiet moments. Amani's eyes met the lioness's steady gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Trust was never freely given in the wild, and here it hovered, fragile and tentative, in the quiet space shared by three lives. The lioness's breath came slow and steady, a soft exhale mixing with the faint sounds of the cub's feeding. She inched forward just enough to touch the bottle with her nose, hesitating briefly before pulling back. The moment was delicate, an unspoken offering, a tentative step toward connection. The cub shifted slightly in Amani's arms, eyes fluttering open, sensing the presence nearby but too weak to respond fully. Amani's voice was low and calm. "It's okay," she whispered, words carrying no force, only care. The lioness's ears twitched, tuned to the softness of the human's voice and the fragile life at its center. Around them, the grass bent gently in the breeze, sunlight filtering through branches and dappled patches. The vast conservancy seemed to hold its breath, watching as an unlikely bond began to form. Time slowed in this small clearing where nature and nurture met. The lioness's gaze never left the cub or the bottle. Her body relaxed further, no longer tense or defensive. She took a few small steps closer, maintaining a respectful distance, but showing an openness that surprised even Amani. The fragile trust was growing, built on quiet moments and careful gestures rather than words. Amani continued to feed the cub steadily, the milk flowing slowly but surely, each swallow a lifeline. The lioness stayed close, watching with eyes full of watchful patience and something softer, perhaps hope. The bond between them was still tentative, easily broken, but undeniably present. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the grass and the figures in the clearing, the three lives existed in delicate balance. The cub's soft breaths and steady feeding were signs that survival might still be possible. The lioness's quiet presence spoke of protection and acceptance, and Amani's careful hands offered a bridge between worlds. In the silence that followed, there was no need for words, only the shared understanding that this moment, fragile and fleeting, carried the weight of hope. The afternoon sun filtered through the acacia leaves, casting patches of light and shadow across the clearing. Hours had passed since the cub began feeding, and the quiet stillness settled deep between the three lives intertwined in this fragile moment. Amani sat calmly, her eyes never leaving the lioness who lingered nearby. The wild mother's posture had softened from tense vigilance to something quieter, almost contemplative. The cub's breathing was steadier now, faint movements signaling slow recovery. Amani extended her hand slowly, palm open and steady, a gesture not meant to force, but to invite. The lioness watched intently, muscles still poised beneath tawny fur, eyes reflecting both caution and curiosity. Time seemed to stretch, every heartbeat loud in the hush. The wind shifted softly, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant trees, wrapping the clearing in a gentle embrace. Then, with a movement so subtle it might have been missed, the lioness stepped forward, her powerful head lowered slowly, the tips of her whiskers brushing against Amani's outstretched fingers. The touch was feather-light, but charged with meaning, an offering of fragile trust, a break in the long-held barrier between wild and human. Amani's breath caught, her heart steady but full. The lioness nuzzled once more, pressing her head softly against the warmth of Amani's hand. The small connection held weight beyond words, a silent promise that the wild mother recognized the care given to her cub. It was not surrender, but acceptance, a moment where fear and suspicion yielded to a tentative bond. Amani remained still, her hand steady, allowing the lioness space to decide. The quiet stretched on, filled only by the slow rhythm of breaths and the soft rustle of leaves. Around them, the conservancy breathed in time with the fragile peace forged here. The cub stirred lightly, sensing the shift nearby, its small head turning toward the gentle contact. The lioness's eyes met Amani's once more, no longer wary but softened by understanding. In that gaze lay the raw power of survival and the first steps toward healing. Hope rose in the space between them, fragile but undeniable. Hunger had brought them here, but trust now held the promise of something more. The wild and human, so often divided, found a moment of connection born from necessity and quiet compassion. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grass, the lioness withdrew slowly, stepping back but no longer distant. She remained close, her presence a shield and a sign that the fragile bond was holding. Amani lowered her hand gently, eyes bright with cautious relief. The fight was far from over, but in this gesture, hope had found its voice. The wild and the tame met briefly, bridging a divide that often seemed too vast. The clearing settled once more into calm, the soft sounds of life moving around them. The lioness stood watchful, yet peaceful, the cub resting with newfound strength, and Amani carrying with her the quiet knowledge that trust, however delicate, could heal where hunger had failed. Several days had passed since the cub was found weak and barely breathing. The sun rose softly over Old Pajeda Conservancy, casting warm light on the grasslands as the cub lay nestled in a shaded clearing. Its body, once frail and wasted, now showed faint signs of strength returning. The ribs were still visible beneath the thinning fur, but the shallow breaths had grown steadier, more deliberate. Amani sat quietly nearby, watching with steady eyes, careful not to disturb the fragile progress. Slowly, the cub twitched, muscles trembling as if waking from a long, heavy sleep. It shifted its weight unevenly, trying to push itself up. The movement was unsteady, shaky, a tentative effort that spoke volumes of the fight still left inside. The cub's small legs buckled beneath it, wobbling beneath the unfamiliar strain. Each effort was met with brief pauses to rest, breath catching, but determination pushed it forward. The lioness remained close by, a watchful guardian in the shadows. Her eyes followed every movement of the cub, protective but alert to any sign of danger. Though her body was relaxed compared to the first days, the wild instinct never left her. She stood between the cub and the open grassland, a silent shield against the unpredictable world beyond. Amani's breath was steady as she observed, heart quietly swelling with cautious hope. This struggle to stand was the cub's first real step toward survival, a moment heavy with promise yet laced with risk. If the cub could not find strength in its legs, if exhaustion overtook it, the days ahead would grow darker still. But the will to rise was itself a sign of life, refusing to give up. The cub pushed upward again, limbs trembling, claws digging lightly into the dirt for balance. It let out a soft whimper, the sound raw but alive. The lioness responded instantly, a low rumble vibrating in her throat. She stepped closer, gently brushing her nose along the cub's side as if lending silent encouragement. The wild mother's presence was both comfort and warning, a reminder of the harsh world outside this fragile circle. Amani moved slowly to offer water, careful not to startle either lion. The cub licked hesitantly at the dampness, a small but important action in regaining strength. The lioness watched with narrowed eyes, ears twitching at every sound, always alert yet patient. As the sun climbed higher, the cub took another shaky step. Its legs wobbled but held, carrying it a few uncertain paces before it settled down again. The effort was exhausting, but each movement was a victory. Amani whispered softly, "You're doing well," a quiet acknowledgement of the battle fought in silence. The clearing seemed to hold its breath around them, the tension between fragility and strength palpable. The lioness's gaze never left the cub, protective and watchful, but no longer distant. Amani knew this was only the beginning of the cub's journey, a fragile recovery that demanded time, patience, and care. The wind rustled the tall grass, carrying the scent of earth and life. Around them, the conservancy stretched vast and wild, full of dangers and mysteries. But here, in this small pocket of hope, the cub had taken its first real step forward. The fragile bond between human and wild remained unbroken, held together by quiet moments like this, by struggle, care, and an unspoken promise that survival was still within reach. The sun hung low over Old Pajeda Conservancy, its last warm rays filtering through the branches of scattered acacia trees. Shadows lengthened across the golden grass, softening the edges of the day as dusk settled in. The air cooled with the promise of night, carrying the scent of earth and dry leaves. The cub, once frail and nearly lost, now stood unsteadily on trembling legs. Each step was careful and deliberate, the muscles still weak, but fueled by a stubborn will to survive. The lioness moved ahead with quiet purpose, her powerful frame a steady guide into the shelter of the trees. Her eyes flicked back often, watchful and protective, ensuring the cub followed closely. Amani stood quietly a short distance away, her breath steady as she watched the pair move deeper into the wild. The bond formed here, the fragile connection between human care and untamed nature, felt almost sacred in the fading light. The clearing grew still, the soft rustle of grass and distant calls of wildlife the only sounds that remained. It was a moment suspended between worlds, where hope and instinct met quietly beneath the vast African sky. The cub paused beneath the canopy, its small head turning back to glance once more at the open grass. Its eyes held uncertainty, the unfamiliar shadows of the trees both a shelter and a mystery. A faint whimper escaped its lips, carried gently on the cooling breeze. The lioness lowered her head in response, pressing her nose softly against the cub's side. A silent nudge, a tender encouragement to move forward. Together, they slipped deeper into the shadows, disappearing among the twisted trunks and thick brush. Amani's eyes lingered on the empty space where the cub had been moments before. The fading light wrapped the scene in a quiet glow, painting the grass and trees with soft hues of gold and violet. The memory of this fragile rescue clung to the air, a story of survival written not in words but in trust, care, and the unspoken promise between a mother and her child. The wind shifted gently, carrying scents of earth, dry grass, and distant watering holes. Somewhere beyond the trees, other lions stirred, their low roars mingling with the calls of birds settling for the night. The wild reclaimed its own here, as it always had, indifferent yet beautiful. But the moment shared in the clearing, the life saved, the bond forged, would remain with Amani long after the sun disappeared below the horizon. She stepped back through the tall grass, careful with each movement, as if not to disturb the delicate balance that had been reached. The cub's recovery was only the first step in a long journey. The wild held dangers and uncertainties, and survival was never guaranteed. But for now, hope glimmered like the last light slipping through the branches. The day's work was done. The quiet weight of what had been shared settled in her chest, a reminder that even in a world ruled by instinct and harsh realities, moments of compassion could bridge divides. The fragile trust that grew between human and wild was a fragile thread, easily broken but powerful when held with care. As the sun sank lower, the sky deepened into shades of pink and purple. Stars began to flicker faintly overhead, the vast African night awakening around her. The lioness and cub were gone, swallowed by the wilderness that shaped their lives, yet the echo of their passage remained, a soft imprint on the land and in Amani's memory. She turned away slowly, each step carrying her back toward the camp. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the distant sound of the pride's calls, steady, strong, a reminder that life pulsed on in rhythms old as the earth itself. The cub's survival was uncertain, the road ahead long and perilous, but the fragile bond born here was a beginning. In the quiet dark, under the canopy of stars, the wild held its breath. Somewhere beyond the trees, a mother and her cub moved onward, shadows embraced by night, tied together by instinct and the brief, gentle touch of human kindness.